What if RFID actually worked the way warehouse teams expect it to? Sonaria delivers RFID without friction with simple, operator-friendly workflows that drive fast business results. Warehouse workers want clear and intuitive user interfaces. Sonaria delivers that with practical and direct solutions. Learn how warehouse executives are cutting manual work, trusting inventory again, and improving KPIs without burdening the floor at sonaria.com. That's SONARIA.com.
The New Warehouse Podcast, hosted by Kevin Lawton, is your source for insights and ideas from the distribution, transportation, and logistics industry. A new episode every Monday morning brings you the latest from industry experts and thought leaders. And now, here's Kevin.
Hey, it's Kevin with the New Warehouse Podcast, bringing you a new episode today. And on today's episode, we are going to talk all about RFID. And I'm going to be joined by John Wirthlin. He is the Senior Product and Marketing Manager at Sonaria. And we are going to learn what Sonaria does. And we're going to dive into RFID, figure out how they are bringing it into the warehouse operations, making it easy and accessible for warehouse operators, and how you can bring it into your ecosystem and your supply chain as well, and leverage this technology. So, John, welcome to the show. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, Kevin. Thank you very much. Yes. Appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. Happy to get you on here. Happy to talk about this topic for sure. I think that it's certainly a technology that is bubbling up more and more, is becoming more accessible, and looking forward to learning more about that from you here today and how Sonaria is helping that accessibility increase. So why don't we kick it off here first? Tell us a little bit about Sonaria and what it is that you all do.
So Sonaria is really an outcome software. We're typically known in the industry as a RFID and IoT kind of a middleware platform. And really what that means is we take the raw, RFID read events or data, and we turn those into business events in the warehouse and manufacturing teams actually care about. So we really sit between, the hardware, the sensing hardware, and the systems of records like the warehouse management systems, ERPs, things like that. And we orchestrate really that real-time visibility without kind of ripping and replacing out of different pieces. So we're really focused on the operational use cases. Okay. And lately it's been really around the dock door, receiving, shipment verification, aggregation of cases to pallets, and then getting more in, just asset tracking, MRO, work in progress and return. So those are a lot of the operational use cases that we're seeing a lot of issues around, a lot of errors that RFID is able to approach. So we really kind of approach it with our slogan is no more, do more. Mm-hmm. So if we can do it faster with fewer people and fewer errors, that's where we're really seeing that. And, for our ISV partners out there, Sonaria is really that horizontal visibility layer that they can embed into their overall solution to really unlock the value, without really becoming RFID experts themselves. They're able to, start using RFID without it, kind of overburdening them, if you will.
Yeah. Interesting. And I love that you're obviously, we're all about the warehouse operators, right? So obviously love that you're looking at it from the perspective of how do you make it easier for them to use and make it practical in a sense, right? Taking that data that's being generated through these tags and things of that nature and translating it into something that's actionable or visible to those operators, which I think is important. So let's talk a little bit about, from an RFID perspective. Obviously, RFID technology has been around for a while, right? But when it was first kind of introduced, it was, it was expensive, right, to adopt and think about, putting a tag on every piece of product that we had, unless we had a very premium product or something that was very precious, right? But
Right.
as of right now in 2026, I mean, where are we in terms of RFID, and has that narrative kind of changed and shifted?
Yeah, so really, RFID used to be expensive because it was complex. The complexity was really not hardware; it was really the cost there. What I always tell people is, they say, is it the right time? And I use an analogy. I said, if we can agree that Walmart is one of the more frugal organizations on the planet, and they're seeing the need to put RFID tags on packages of underwear, it's probably starting to make sense, right?
Sure.
And that's really where we're seeing some of those adoptions in the retail, spilling over into manufacturing and warehousing, and that's really helping not only the equipment get better and less expensive, but it's driving down that per tag cost that used to be the sticker price where people couldn't get their head around. So now, the real barrier is integration complexity and unclear ROI. And so, RFID used to fail because it was this cool tech instead of, a measurable business outcome. So that's kind of where things died. So now, again, it's become more affordable. And the key is, when it's implemented with, clear business outcomes and KPIs and scope to use cases, then, RFID and Sonaria, we really help to reduce costs by, really abstracting the reader complexity, able to reuse the infrastructure. So if we do a solution at the dock door, we start with outbound, we can use that same infrastructure for, inbound use cases. And I think the big thing is, avoiding those one-off custom integrations, and custom development is also really helping out as well. When with Sonaria, we're building receiving is receiving, shipping is shipping. We understand there's different nuances, but we're really putting emphasis on what those workflows are, and what the business outcomes are. Having those conversations first, because we know the technology is mature. So the technology becomes a supporting to what those business outcomes need to be.
Got it. Yeah. And I think it's very interesting. And I love the example you gave, right? If Walmart's putting it on underwear, right? I guess we're at a point where it's pretty viable to be more widespread. And you mentioned in the beginning there, right? Sonaria is adding kind of this software layer, right? To result in business outcomes that make sense. So maybe tell us a little bit about, RFID as just a standalone technology, right? Like what is that generating? And then how are you taking that and how are you making it more digestible for the operation itself?
Yeah. So, what we're doing is we're what I call replacing the beep. We've been going around, for the last 20, 30 years with a handheld, doing line of sight technology. And what happens is the operator, scans an item, and they look at their handheld and they get direction on what they need to do. With RFID, it's invisible, right? It's kind of magic. So, things coming through a threshold, like a dock door we're trying to do receiving, we in the past we might hook it up to a stack light, so we know that something happened, either good or bad. Kind of like we talked about idiot lights in your car and your dash, right?
Yeah.
I didn't really say a lot. So what we're doing with Sonaria is we're really understanding the operational workflows and giving the user, a screen, if you were a tablet on a forklift, to actually say, here's what you're doing. You went into this, to this truckload. It's got 25 pallets you're going to unload, and it's actually giving you an indicator of, how you're doing. And then as things go off and through that RFID event, it's scrolling up and letting you know what's happening in real time. And then that information is getting compared, to their back-end systems or a bill of lading, and telling if there's an exception or not. So what we're doing is we're taking the magic of RFID, which is really what we need, and we're aligning that with the workflow of the operator. So it's very simple. What we say is we're Fisher Price simple and sausage finger friendly. So we're really trying to make that mystery easier. And what we're seeing is the adoption is really being expounded, so that it's not, oh my God, I got to learn something new. I've been doing this for 20 years. I don't want to learn anything new. It's becoming very natural. There's really not a lot of training that needs to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's such a great way to put it, right? And I love when you say it's Fisher Price simple and sausage finger friendly, right? I think that makes a lot of sense for those that are tapping into the system and using it, especially, interacting with it on a daily basis, whether that's loading or unloading the trucks, and need to know, is there an issue? Is there not an issue, right? And what do I do? And how do I take action there to be able to do that? I think, interpreting in that way makes a lot of sense. So from an RFID perspective, I'm curious, you gave the example there of Walmart, putting RFID tags on underwear, right? But for others, if we're not Walmart, right? I mean, when does it make sense, or, when is the point where people should start to consider bringing RFID into their supply chain?
Yeah, so the right time to invest is obviously the big question, right? So really, it's when manual process become the bottleneck. We talk a lot about dock door, making sure the right things are on the truck, automating the receipting, but really, where are we having errors? Where is it taking a lot of time? So if you're dealing with high labor costs, inventory accuracy issues, missed shipments, shrink loss, misplaced assets, that's where RFID starts flipping from a business necessity, not a nice to have.
Mm.
So the best candidates we're seeing is really where there's high volume, higher value assets, or kind of a interchange there. Serialized assets, we're getting into some of the regulatory areas around the FDA with the pharma and food regulations that are coming out, where we have to track serialized assets. That becomes a really hard thing to do with barcoding, and RFID becomes something that's a really good alternative. And the other thing is just time sensitive operations. When you think about e-commerce, you want to know that what you're selling is what's on in your warehouse or at your store. So making sure that what you're promising the customer is there, and they don't have a bad experience, because it's so easy to switch from one supplier to another, or go shop at one place to another, to a different place because they didn't have the bananas you were looking for,
Yeah.
or the right size underwear in that case, right?
Yeah.
So just really, again, if I know more and my reality is the same as what I have in the system, that's where we're seeing RFID helping out a lot and really pushing out some business outcomes.
Yeah. Very interesting points there. And I think obviously, the inventory accuracy is a huge one, right? Because, when you think about just trying to track inventory through simple barcode scanning, right? It's very, very easy to misplace items, right? And I spent several years working in inventory control, and it take you a couple seconds to misplace an item, but it could take you days or weeks to find that item again, depending on how big your operation is and how many SKUs you have and all those things. So the ability to get closer and pinpoint more location wise from an RFID perspective obviously is incredibly attractive to improve upon that, but also some of the additional benefits that you mentioned there as well. So when we look at implementing RFID, and then implementing not only RFID but then also with the Sonaria platform on top of it, what are some of the kind of KPIs that you see immediate impact to, and maybe even some examples that you could give us from customers?
Yeah, and that's the key, right? The key is not to try and boil the ocean. The key is to find some low-hanging fruit, something that's easy to test. It's going to give you, direct benefits right away. And really, we've seen that at the dock door. Automate, making sure the right thing's on the right truck is something that, from an RFID standpoint, is pretty straightforward. So I'm not really concerned about the technology. I'm just really understanding, how do I apply a business rule? How do I get the right information from the back end system? And that's something that we can, you can knock out of the park. And what happens is then when the client understands that, hey, this thing actually works, then they start thinking, where else can I apply this technology? And then it starts growing from there. But, dock to stock, 70% to 80% faster. How do I do that better? Inventory accuracy, 99% or above, and not having to have a team of, 10 to 12 cycle counters that are making that, 95%, right? And then, reducing that cycle counting effort from, by 60 to 70% are things we're seeing, and eliminating shipping errors. And the other thing is, helping to find assets and reducing that by 90%. And that's in warehousing. That could be in a hospital trying to find a wheelchair or a pump. We're seeing that kind of in a lot of different verticals. And what we're doing at Sonaria is we're really focusing on what are those core capabilities that are adjacent to and applicable to different verticals, and how do we solve that in one place, but also make it so that it also solves that use case in other verticals too. So really, what you're doing is you're changing the way operations looks to be more from reactive to proactive. If the wrong thing is on the wrong truck, that's a proactive thing. I've got to, figure out how I'm going to get that back. I've got to resolve that, ship it somewhere else, and then, you take a hit with your customer as well. So finding those issues up front is definitely where we're seeing the traction right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's very interesting examples there. And, being able to understand where things are is just a big leap forward in anybody's supply chain, right? Just to understand whether it's inventory, whether it's assets, whether it's just items that you need for production, whatever the case may be. I mean, that makes a huge difference, right? And getting down to, the last couple units, and all of a sudden you can't find them, right? That becomes a big issue, right? And results in potential customer dissatisfaction and things of that nature. So very interesting to hear that here. So now tell us a little bit about kind of, working with Sonaria and, the operator focus, right? Which I think is fantastic. Tell us a little bit about, what does that look like from like their day-to-day work perspective, right? If they're currently, maybe not using RFID or just have RFID without the platform on top of it, how does that change what their task may look like today? And what does it look like with the platform in place? Does it add extra steps? Does it reduce steps? Like what does that look like?
Sure. So what we look at it with Sonaria is, this is going to sound a little harsh, but good RFID, when done right and done efficiently, it removes steps, and bad RFID kind of adds them. Okay. So if you set up, specific RFID and you're looking at it from just strictly an hardware engineering perspective, then what you start doing is you start saying, all right, I need you to do something different or strange in order for this technology to work. What we've done in Sonaria is we've understood what operations needs, and we've made sure that the workflow is first and foremost, and the technology is secondary. Because what we've done is over the last 3 to 5 years, RFID is now an accepted technology. 3 years ago, it was right on that experimental, thought. So when you think about crossing the chasm, lots of people have crossed the chasm from a technology standpoint, but the user experience hasn't crossed along with it. And I think that's what we're doing with Sonaria, is we're trying to make that very useful. So I mean, we can still put a stack light up if that's what the customer wants, but having that information more in line with the vehicle and a forklift, or even having a screen in different areas. So if I want to know that when a pallet moves from one place to another, just having a screen in that area to show the driver that happened, that's something that really helps reinforce that the technology is actually supporting the workflows and you're getting improvements. And then what happens is, since I'm seeing those things in real time, I can also start looking at that data and figure out where I can make improvements or where my efficiencies are. And so eliminating scanning, reducing those confirmation steps really is replacing those manual checks with automatic verification. So operators start trusting the system because it does the work for them, not because they're forced to use it.
Yes. And I think that's I love that last line, right? Because it does the work for them, not because they're choosing, right? And I think, that makes so much sense to be able to create that better interaction, right? And I love that you distinguish between the bad RFID implementation versus the good RFID implementation, because I do think, RFID kind of gets almost a blanket statement, right? Of it just improves the visibility, right? But it needs a vehicle, right, to be able to deliver the actual information that it's collecting in a way that's digestible and actionable, right? And maybe at a higher level, like you said, at engineering level or something like that. Okay, like that data can be analyzed and sorted through and understood, but somebody that's riding around on the forklift all day and their office is the forklift cab, right, is
Right.
looking for like an immediate thing, right? They don't have time to do an analysis or sort through the information or data, right? They need that trigger to say like, okay, this is good, move forward, or there's an issue here, I need to take some kind of action, right? So I'm curious because I've seen some of what you're working on, right, from a user interface perspective, right? I'm curious, as you approach the user interaction piece of this, how do you look at developing that interface? Because the experience, I think, as we look at, obviously the younger generations coming into the workforce and stuff, they're used to a very nice user experience because they've grown up with smartphones and tablets and things like that, right? So how do you make sure that when you're developing this, right, you take an existing technology like RFID, and how do you disseminate it to make it something that's very easy to interact with and make it very digestible for the masses, basically?
I have an operations background, so I started my logistics career, in the late 80s in the Air Force doing medical logistics, and we didn't even have barcode scanners. Everything was putting into a dumb terminal, but we had a pick list, that we generated on, you remember that green bar paper? I used to print that out every morning for everybody, and a lot of times that really hasn't changed. At the end of the day, we still have customers that are riding around with paper and clipboards attached to forklifts. We have customers that have a system like an SAP or something like that, where they have a pick list that's digital. At the end of the day, there's a list of something that's happening that's in their vocabulary. So what we've done is we've made a very standardized approach to normalize, if you will, that information or that experience that we're seeing in the industry. And how do we display that? So we could create the experience so that it's 90% applicable to everybody without, and then we can configure the rest. What I mean by that is, if in your instance an item number is called a SKU, that's a configuration change in Sonaria. That's not a rewrite. Okay. If you call an order, a job, we can do that rewrite. And sometimes those vocabularies are really anchored into the culture there. And so it's important to give that information, back to the user as they're used to experiencing it. And what we're doing with Sonaria is we're building that into the approach in our software, so that we can, stay true to the data that's in logistics. Really doesn't change. I used to do presentations for healthcare logistics, and after I was in 100 hospitals, I said, once you've seen one hospital, you've seen one hospital. Because everybody's doing the same thing. They just do it a little bit different or have a little bit language. So we're building that in to Sonaria. So again, the adoption's there, and it doesn't look foreign when an operator is trying to adopt that technology, whether it's a 20-something-year-old or a 60-something-year-old like me, getting close to that. So that's really what I think of the differences, Sonarias, and we're the gap that we're trying to fill in the marketplace right now.
Yeah. And I think that makes so much sense. And, I love that you put in there, whether somebody's 20 or 60, right, they're going to be able to come in and understand what this system is telling them, right, or be able to interpret that, which goes a long way, as I'm sure in the warehouse operations, right, to be able to get somebody up and running as quick as possible from a training aspect, and then just understanding how to do whatever they need to do. Time is definitely money in that sense, right, and you obviously have situations where turnover can be high, right? So bringing people in, getting them up and running as quickly as possible becomes very important within that. So now when we look at some of these technologies that are out there now, right? I mean, we see a lot of stuff going on with AI. Obviously, we see robotics, automation, all of these different things. So tell us, how does RFID and the Sonaria platform, how does that kind of fall within this ecosystem, and is there benefits to utilizing RFID in collaboration with some of these other technologies? How does that kind of all come together in the ecosystem?
Yeah, RFID and Sonaria, I'll use those terms synonymously, but really what RFID and Sonaria is, we become that real-time truth layer that AI and robotics depend on. So right now AI is depending on what's in the back end system, and that we're assuming that's true, right? So they're only getting the data that they can capture. What RFID does is it provides that continuous location awareness that robotics and AI use, real time inventory state. So I don't have to tell you that a box is sitting there, sitting there, sitting there.
Hmm.
I just need to tell you when it's moved or when its state's changed, so that that's the information that AI is using to make decisions. And quite frankly, we're starting to see, robotic, autonomous forklifts, things like that.
Hmm.
And that's going to be very important as we go forward and seeing that expand. Is that both those technologies really need to have clean, structured events that they can leverage with their platforms. And so without RFID, AI guesses. With RFID, AI decides.
I see. Interesting. And I like that. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? Because, a lot of people, rightfully so, are cautious around AI, and if it's going to guess, right, or do some hallucinations in some aspects, right, but being able to give it that data and that information of more accurate location and where these things are, or the status, as you mentioned, to be able to do that obviously is going to give you better results on that sense, right? Because the AI powered things, and robotics, the data that they're interpreting, right, the actions that they take are only going to be as good as the data that they're being fed, right, at the end of the day. So definitely enabling that. And now if we look at RFID, we talked kind of about, when does it make sense to start to look at RFID and bring it into your supply chain and your operations? But how does someone actually get started with RFID? If they say, okay, we heard the points that John made here, and we feel like we're in that position, right? But how do we actually get started with this? How do we start to bring the tags in? How do we start to bring the technology in? What does that look like? And how does someone prepare themselves to get ready for bringing this into their supply chain?
Yeah. So first of all, you want to start with business outcomes, not the hardware.
Mm-hmm.
So when you start reaching out to these technology providers, really help them focus on what the business outcomes are. Because at the end of the day, step one is identifying one painful, measurable problem. We talked about misshipments. What does a misshipment mean to your organization? How do you quantify that? What happens if slow receiving happens? If my dock is the bottleneck and trucks are waiting and you're starting to get dwell time fees and things like that, those are things that you can quantify. What happens if I can't find an asset? When in the healthcare realm, we see healthcare workers starting to hoard critical assets like a heart monitor. They might put that in a drawer because they know that
Yeah.
if there's an issue, they need to know where that is. And so what happens is it doesn't come up on inventory because we've actually seen those up in the ceiling tiles, because
wow.
So what happens is
Okay.
the organization buys another healthcare monitor. Same thing happens in warehousing and things like that. I went into warehouses just like you probably had and says, yep, our asset utilization is great. It comes into the Alligator warehouse and you look at a box and it's got 2 inches of dust on it. And it's just what you don't know is what you don't know. And I think this technology helps you do that. So start with something simple, start at the dock door. That's really where there's so much ROI there. That seems to be a really good place. It's also very risk low from a technology standpoint and an integration standpoint. Pilot just one use case. Make it simple. One dock door, one use case, not the entire warehouse, and just get comfortable with that initial integration and then expand from there. Trying to figure out what are the KPI improvements and then scale. Sonaria helps you do this, but we support different reader types. So we support Zebra and Pinch, all these different areas. We support different handhelds, different printers. So we work with a lot of different partners that deliver those hardwares, so we can help you with that. And then we have a really good integration layer. So we use webhooks, REST APIs, a lot of different things. So we've integrated an Access database all the way up to a full blown ERP system like an Oracle or an SAP. So that's really not an issue anymore. I mean, 5 years ago, you thought, okay, it's going to cost me $100,000 in 6 weeks to do integration. Now it's down to a week. Really the integration isn't about the business rules. It's about security. Learning how do I get through the firewalls and all the security that's for a customer. That takes usually 90% of it. And then really just understanding what are the APIs that system, uses, and how do we leverage it? So, integration is fairly quick, especially if you start with something very simple, and then it can grow from there. So the other thing that Sonaria does specifically is, you know, when you think about passive RFID, it's like when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. We also
Mhm.
work with other sensing technologies like
Yeah.
Bluetooth Low Energy, ultra wideband. So we work with those different things so that we can make sure that we're using the right sensing technology for that job. Boxes, things like that. Passive RFID is really good. That's going to be the best thing for your package of underwear, right?
Mhm.
But if you want to track forklifts or you want to track, yard trailers, we can also ingest that information and normalize it under a single pane of glass. So now you kind of go back to your AI. I can now understand that this carrier is connected to Doctor 12 and ASN 1234 is connected to Doctor 12. Now I've made that connection from the items going on to the ASN, making sure those are from the right carrier and at the right doctor. So I'm making those connections very logically. So, it's successful and it's treated as a business transformation tool,
Mm.
not an IT project. I mean, IT is obviously very important, but it's really got to be business operational focus, and you have to have those director, senior director, VP operational personas in the conversation at the beginning in order for this to be successful.
Mm. Interesting and good advice. And I love the fact that you said like take one kind of business outcome you're looking at and try like a pilot on that. Now, what about from the because obviously your product or whatever you're trying to track now needs to get these tags on there, right? So how does that transition typically work, right? Is it like, okay, we're gonna start with our next batch of production and just make sure those tags are getting on there? Or do you see people like proactively go out into their warehouse operations, start tagging things? What is the typical kind of approach to that?
Yeah, well, it really depends. I mean, that's where the technology and the operations start coming together.
Mm.
So traditionally, what you would do is you would have a partner come in or integrator come in, and they would take a look at the workflows of what you're going to do. So again, I'll stick with the piloting at the dock door. So we want to look at, are we tagging at the pallet level and understanding, those conditions, the environment, how are things getting loaded on the truck, so we can understand how that we can successfully read that tag, right? And then a lot of it's education. A lot of people don't understand that the RFID inlay or the antenna and microchip are actually built into the label. So the label actually usually doesn't change.
Mm.
We just need to understand what is the key data element that we're going to embed and encode into the RFID chip. And then what we do is we test different inlays to make sure that the read performance is as good as it can be at that particular choke point, if you will. And then we work with them to understand, all right, now we need to figure out what kind of printer you need to be able to encode that. And now we're just simply swapping out an RFID enabled printer and RFID enabled media into an area where they're already printing out those pallet labels or those carton labels, things like that. So
Mm.
it's really a kind of a search and replace, if you will. And then it starts to flow because, again, all these things are really done with barcoding a lot. So we're really just capturing non-line of sight the same data that you would with barcoding. So it's not really again a rip and replace. It's a merge on the traffic, if you will.
Gotcha. Okay. Interesting. Yes. Yes. I was curious about how people handle that. So very interesting and very insightful there. So really interesting to dive into the RFID technology here with you today, John, and learn about how Sonaria is making RFID kind of more accessible, more easy to work with, and giving those kind of actionable items to be able to do for the operator themselves, right? And being able to interpret that in an easy way. And I think you're also have been sharing kind of a superhero comic strip kind of graphic thing, helping to educate people around this technology, right? There he is, Super John there, right? So,
yes,
tell us a little bit about that.
We've never been seen in the same place, so it's definitely not me. But the thing is, the comic book kind of gets the chuckle,
Mm-hmm.
but really what this is about, and you can go on Sonaria.com and look at this, but it's around what are the operational KPIs that somebody, says, hey, that's me. Like you said earlier, I'm having this problem. And then it helps us really kind of bring everybody's guard down a little bit on the technology, and it helps the integrator focus on those business outcomes. And as an industry, we're not good at that.
Mm.
We're good at solving engineering problems, and,
Mhm.
and the data in the RFID code is called an EPC. So we're all about, oh, what's the EPC?
Mm.
The operator doesn't care, right? They want to see that, hey, this is the pallet that I'm supposed to ship, and these are the things. So we're trying to make sure that we transform the technology what it needs to be. So when we're doing testing, we want to look at technology,
Mm.
but when we're doing operations, we want to look at operationally focused information. How do we display that? And
Yeah.
that's either it can be on a handheld with a handheld scanner, or it could be with a fixed reader with some kind of what I call an information radiator, whether it's a display above a dock door, or on a vehicle mounted unit, something like that. So lots of
Absolutely.
different options, but the closer we can get the data to the existing workflow, and the better we can align that data's timeliness to the workflow and to the operator, the better the adoption is, and the quicker the value that
Mm.
that customer is going to realize benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the comic book series. I think it's a great way, as you said, to kind of simplify the technology and explain it to people and how it's going to benefit them in a non-technical way, which not everybody understands, right? Which I think makes a lot of sense for what you're trying to do for the operator themselves and the people that are moving those packages and pallets every single day. And how does this actually impact me, right? And what do I need to do to accomplish my task, which I think is the spot on, definitely. So very interesting to hear from you today, John, and learn more about this. If people are interested in learning more about Sonaria and maybe getting into RFID, what's the best way to get in touch or learn more?
Yeah, if you go to our website at www.sonaria, sonaria.com, I almost love that up, but you'll have a link to it with your podcast. You could see the different use cases that we do, and then there's a contact me page that'll get that information to me. Then I would be glad to reach out and discuss not only Sonaria, but again, try to understand where those pain points are and start that discussion there, and then figure out what's a good partner that would work with you guys. So, Kevin, this has been a really great discussion. I really appreciate it, and hopefully this has helped your audience understand that RFID isn't an experiment anymore,
Mm-hmm.
and that there really are some solutions out there that will help you bring value quicker and and increase adoption even to the most resistant person in your organization.
Sure, absolutely. And very great conversation with you here, John. And we'll definitely put all the information about Sonaria in the show notes, as well as at thenewwarehouse.com, so people can easily find it. So, John, thank you once again for your time on the show today.
You've been listening to the New Warehouse Podcast with Kevin Lawton. Subscribe and check us out online at thenewwarehouse.com.
Enjoyed this episode? Make sure you are subscribed to the podcast, and for more content from the New Warehouse, find us on LinkedIn and YouTube. Links to subscribe can be found in the show notes, and for everything The New Warehouse, head to thenewwarehouse.com.